Well, today we're having class online because there is 100 feet of snow out on the ground. I hope you're staying warm and dry wherever you are, and also that you're finding ways to appreciate this beauty. It's amazing. Today we're getting into our God is Not section, and we're really jumping right in with what might be a sensitive or controversial topic, which is nationalism. And we'll be dealing with a few of these things that are kind of close to our heart, maybe that we feel in the gut, whether we're talking about America or we're going to talk about capitalism. And I just want to remind you that the reason we're dealing with these things that are close to our gut is because we're trying to see what has influenced our picture of God. And that's going to be those things at the bottom of the iceberg, the deep things. And so the fact that we're talking about things that feel a little uncomfortable is a good sign. It's a sign that we're talking about the right sorts of things because we're getting at deep issues. So I just ask that you have an open mind as we examine these things and really focus on, if you're feeling something, why am I feeling this? What's causing this? So really focus on your own reactions. Last time we thought about the images of God that we carry with us. And of course, there's the God in the sky with the white beard and the crown. And I just want to point out this is actually nothing new. This picture of God goes all the way back, at least to ancient Persia. This is from a Zoroastrian temple. And there you see God as an old man with a beard. This was absorbed by Israelites when they were in Babylonian captivity and when they were under the Persian Empire. They absorbed a lot of ideas from Zoroastrianism, ideas about God and ideas about Satan. And those transferred into Christianity and kind of made their way into our own time. So it's no surprise. Scholars, researchers have asked Americans how they view God. And maybe you don't think of God like the Monty Python God. Interestingly, this is what they found. This is the composite image which most Americans thought God looked like. Now, if we were together, I would ask for your observations on this, but you may notice that it's fairly, it's not gendered specific. In fact, it's a little feminine, beardless, short hair. This is a picture of God. And you might say, well, it looks like a composite picture of Americans. Well, that shouldn't surprise us either. When we think of God, we think of us. So here's a reference to that study, The Faces of God in America. Now what these researchers did, you see it's psychology and neuroscience, they actually went further and said, does your political affiliation change the way you view God? And sure enough, conservatives and liberals picture God differently. So as you can see in these two small images, one is the liberal image and the other is the conservative image. And you can see here in the description, liberals tend to see God as relatively more feminine, more African American, more loving. Conservatives tend to see God as older, more intelligent, and more powerful. All participants see God as similar to themselves on attractiveness, age, and to a lesser extent, race. So nationality does matter, and even within that, things like political leaning matters to the way that we picture God. So if this is something that interests you, I encourage you to follow up. You can find the study online. Early Christians were distinguished by their denial of the gods of the nation. I mentioned this last time that Christians were accused of being atheist. This is a quote from the martyrdom of Polycarp, one of the first martyr accounts that we have outside of the Bible. And Polycarp was this 80-year-old man. He was an elder in the church. He was arrested. And when he was brought into the arena to be eaten by the animals, the crowd chanted, "Away with the atheist." Now they meant the Christians. But from the perspective of the average Roman, Christians were actually an atheist group who denied the gods. I'll give you one more piece of this early Christian lore. This early Christian apologist, Minucius Felix, he gives us this dialogue between a believer and a non-believer. Interestingly, one of them says, hey, you're atheist. Why should we be part of your group? And the Christian responds, well, we're not actually atheists. We do believe in God. We just don't believe in your gods. Well, that little dialogue goes on to say this. Caecilius is the pagan interlocutor here. But what makes you people so offensive is your lack of patriotism. You people are happy to benefit from all that is ours, Romans, living in this greatest time of all history, but where is your gratitude? You are antisocial snobs. You will not show proper respect for our anniversary festivals. You will not sacrifice to the genius of the emperor. You will not fight and join the empire. Simply put, you are disloyal, unpatriotic, and not to be trusted. As far as I'm concerned, you are a danger to society. Some of that might sound familiar, language that you've heard even in the present. Sometimes Christians are accused of being unpatriotic, or this or that group is accused of it. Anyway, here's how Octavius the Christian responds. Hold on, one at a time. We do not join the army, and we do not fight because we don't believe in killing. Note, early Christians were what we would call pacifists and refused to join the military. This didn't change until around the 4th century. We love our enemies and do good to them. Even though we're often hunted down and killed because of accusers like you, we do not even take up arms to defend ourselves. So I fail to see how we are any danger to anyone. But yes, you're right, we do not pray to the emperor or join with our neighbors in the sacrifices to the gods. But while we do not pray to the emperor, we do pray for the emperor. We recognize those in authority as appointed by God to preserve order. We pray for the peace and tranquility of the empire. So the early Christians were accused of atheism and of being unpatriotic because they didn't do the things that Romans did. Now, of course, what they're saying is God is not Roman. God is not Zeus, yes, but also God isn't special to the Roman Empire. And the Romans thought that about their gods. Their gods protect our nation. The Christians had also challenged Jewish conceptions of God, even though most early Christians were Jewish. They said, God isn't Jewish. God doesn't just protect Israel in some special way, but God is universal. God is the creator of all people and all nations. They said God is not Zeus, even though Zeus was sometimes called the All-Father, right? They said Zeus is the god of the Greeks and of the Greek culture. God is bigger than Zeus. And so what do American Christians say? God is not, well, you see the imagery transfers almost exactly. No one thinks America is a god, or at least no one would say it that way. No one thinks George Washington is a god. And yet the imagery is the same. The rituals are very similar, as we'll see. There is a religious dimension to a national culture. And the name for this, sociologists have called it civil religion. And the definition is civil religion is the implicit religious values of a nation. They're implicit, not explicit. As expressed through public rituals, symbols like the flag, and ceremonies on sacred days and at sacred places, such as monuments, battlefields, or national cemeteries. Now, all nations have some version of civil religion. The King and Queen of England here, Queen Elizabeth, Prince Charles. Here's Vladimir Lenin lying in state in Moscow. His body is preserved like a medieval saint. The Arc de Triomphe in Paris, which some of you may have seen, contains a lot of religious imagery, a lot of symbolism. So almost every nation thinks that God has favored them. Almost every nation has some dimension of civil religion. It's an important part of political life. So here's a quote. And I'll read the quote, and then I want you to think, who said this? God the Almighty has made our nation. By defending its existence, we are defending his work. Therefore, it is all the more necessary to wield the sword, no matter where and under what circumstances, until final victory crowns our efforts. Here you see civil religion. God has made our nation. And when we fight for our nation, we're fighting for God. And this is pretty common across cultures. Because we're a God-favored nation, you need to do X, Y, or Z. Usually go to war, pay taxes, and so on. Now, who said these things? well, I can't hear your response, but I'll tell you what I often get is something like George Washington, or maybe John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, some founding father. Well, no. It's the founding father of the Nazi Party, Adolf Hitler. This is Nazi propaganda that God's with us, that you should fight in the war. In fact, Nazi belt buckles, the soldiers who went out, their belt buckles said, Gott mit uns, God is with us. And this is the danger of national gods, or perceiving a God who is closely allied with our nation, is that we may commit atrocities on behalf of the nation and think we're doing it on behalf of God. This has happened over and over and over again in human history. And again, this is why it's really important for us to pull out and examine our own worldviews, lest we get caught up in this. So let's think about American civil religion for a few minutes. This is a painting, by the way. I think it's in the Capitol building. It's called The Apotheosis of George Washington. It's George Washington being lifted up into the heavens by angels, and it's based on classical tropes of the Caesars becoming gods. So this term civil religion was coined by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a founding father of what we would call sociology, in the book The Social Contract. Alexis de Tocqueville, whom some of you may know, he applied it to the U.S. in his famous work, Democracy in America. He said the greatest part of British America was peopled by men who, after having shaken off the authority of the Pope, acknowledged no other religious supremacy. They brought with them into the New World a form of Christianity which I cannot better describe than by styling it a democratic and republican religion. So de Tocqueville, this French observer, says that Americans, shook off Catholicism and the papacy, but they replaced it with something else, democratic and republican religion. So this is essentially what civil religion entails. The belief is there's an existence, that God does exist, a belief in the life to come and afterlife, the reward of virtue and punishment of vice, and that all religions should be tolerated. You may notice a similarity here to what we saw in the survey of American teenagers. It's very similar to what the average American teenager believes. This is from a recent piece in the Atlantic just a few years ago. Shadi Hamid writes, but if secularists hoped that declining religiosity would make for more rational politics, drained of faith's inflaming passions, they're likely to be disappointed. As Christianity's hold, in particular, has weakened, ideological intensity and fragmentation have risen. American faith, it turns out, is as fervent as ever. It's just that what was once religious belief has now been channeled into political belief. Political debates over what America is supposed to mean have taken on the character of theological disputations. This is what religion without religion looks like. So what Hamid is pointing out, and what many other scholars have noted, is that as traditional Christianity declines, that a kind of American Christianity or nationalistic faith has taken its place. You can read more about that article if you wish. It's also available online. So what does this look like? What does civil religion in America look like? Well, we can talk about our saints. Just a few weeks ago, we honored Martin Luther King Jr., this great saint who gave his life for the idea of freedom and equality. Abraham Lincoln, really since his assassination, has been regarded as the Redeemer president who also shed his blood so that the nation could be healed after the Civil War. Also someone who fought for justice and so on. And then, of course, George Washington, the founding father, who also risked his life, who nobly refused power, resisted the presidency. These are saints, and what do we do for them? Well, we honor them with a holiday. We get off of work or school for President's Day, or for MLK Jr., and so on. So we have these saints or holy people that embody what America means. We have martyrs. So we recognize these holy places, the Alamo, Pearl Harbor, where people shed their blood, gave their lives for the nation, very similar to the way other religions treat their martyrs. We have other kinds of holy or sacred places, usually marked by some sort of monument. These are concentrated in the state capital, the holy city of Washington, D.C., and that could be the Washington Monument, Lincoln Memorial, MLK Memorial, and they're often based on religious imagery, Christian and non-Christian, as in the case of the Washington Memorial, which is very Eastern. And you can hear this language. I won't play this video. This is one of the videos from the January 6th storming of the Capitol. And the part that I like to play is the rioters are moving into the legislature's hall, and the security guard actually is trying to stop them, and he says, "Hey, you guys can't come in here." He says, "This is the sacredest place." So this is just a security guard, but he's saying, don't come in here. It's like a holy of holies, just like you can't go into the temple unless you're a priest. You guys can't just come into the Capitol building. This is only for certain people. But he used that language of sacredness, which is just very interesting. And as I said, we have holy days, not only to recognize certain saints, but also to recognize the martyrs, soldiers, and Independence Day, the birth of the nation, and so on. These are big days. We get off of work, we get together, we sacrifice animals, cook the meat on grills, and have large communal banquets, which is exactly what the Romans used to do. Are there beliefs? Is there a creed? Well, we already saw a few of them. In his famous I Have a Dream speech, Martin Luther King Jr. wished that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. What's its creed? Well, he's referring to equality and liberty for all, which you may know if you went to an American public school. You probably recited something like this creed. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. My guess is you did this in a ritual fashion where at a certain time of the day everyone stood up, made some sort of gesture, placing their hand over their heart, and recited in unison. Hey, that sounds a lot like what religious people do when they go to church and recite their creeds and make certain holy gestures at certain specific times. Well, the writer of the pledge actually intended that. Francis Bellamy, who wrote the pledge in 1892, wanted the ritual repetition to form children. He said it is the same way with the Catechism or the Lord's Prayer. So he was specifically modeling the Pledge of Allegiance on religious pledges because he wanted to evoke the same kind of feeling. He wanted the children to feel connected to the nation, devoted to the nation, faithful to the nation. So, moving into a little different area, is America a Christian nation? After all, this says that we are one nation under God. Is America one nation under God? Well, the under God part was actually added in 1954, over half a century after the pledge was originally written. What else was going on in early 1950s? Well, this is the Eisenhower presidency. And notice what Eisenhower says here. He says, "Our government makes no sense unless it's founded in a deeply felt religious faith. And I don't care what it is." Eisenhower was a Christian. I think he was a Presbyterian. But he saw the value in civil religion, which is a generic religious faith tied up with the country. He didn't think America was a Christian nation, or at least he didn't think it made much of a difference as long as there was some kind of religious element. By the way, this is also the year, or right around the time, that this motto was adopted for the United States. In God we trust. It took the place of the old motto, E pluribus unum, from the many one, which had been used since the Civil War. Here's the thing we have to ask, and the Eisenhower quote leads us to ask this. When the bill says, "In God we trust," we need to say, which God are we talking about? Which God do we mean? What are the characteristics of this God in which we, the American people, trust? Now, there's a lot of ways we can approach this question. One interesting approach, again, some sociologists have done this, is by analyzing presidential inaugural addresses. When the presidents talk to the nation, they often invoke the name of God. And so we can get some insight into who they understand this God to be. Kennedy's inaugural, which is famous, a brilliant model for our many later addresses. Kennedy, of course, was the first Catholic president. But see if you detect any Catholicism in this. He speaks of Almighty God. He talks about the rights of man come not from the state, but from the hand of God. He concludes the speech, whether you're citizens of America or of the world, ask of us the same high standards of strength and sacrifice that we ask of you. With a good conscience, our only sure reward, with history the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking his blessing and his help, but knowing that here on earth God's work must truly be our own. Pretty typical. So what God are we talking about? Well, it's a mighty God, a God who's the guarantor of human rights. Is this the Christian God? Well, there's no mention of Jesus. In fact, you can comb these speeches over and you will never see references to Jesus or Christ because that's too particular. Now, if you're Christian and listening to this speech, you're thinking about your God. Oh, yeah. What are you thinking about if you're Jewish? What do you think if you're Muslim and you're listening to this speech? Almighty God, God the Creator, and so on. Well, you're probably thinking of Allah. The beauty of this, the genius of it, is that the word God becomes a kind of empty signifier that the listener fills in for themselves. It doesn't really matter what Kennedy thinks or believes. The God of America that he's talking about is a God that anyone can get behind. Anyone who believes in any kind of God. Who mentioned God the most? Well, Nixon mentioned him 6 times, Reagan 8, Bush 3, and Obama 5, just for point of comparison. And what language did they use? Washington calls him that almighty being. Adams called it his providence. Jefferson said that being in whose hands we are. And by the way, Washington, Adams, and Jefferson were all deists. They weren't Christians, at least traditional Christians. And Lincoln called God the almighty ruler of nations. Now, going back to that question of is America a Christian nation or is America under God, here's something else to keep in mind as you think about that. That America has actually gotten more and more Christian over the course of its history. In the earliest days in the colonial era, something like 10% of Americans were actually regular churchgoers, thought of themselves as Christian. Definitely less than a third of the nation was Christian. Some estimates give it as low as 4%. Now, fast forward, in 1990, 85% of American adults identified as Christians. This has gone down in the last 30 years, so that now we're about 65%. But do you see what's happened? America, from its founding, has actually become more and more Christians, at least in terms of the population. But in the last few years, in other words, in the lifetime of your parents, there's been a pretty dramatic decrease. So when people complain that America is a less Christian nation, it probably reflects their own life experience because the generation before us, your parents or your grandparents, they've seen Christianity decline, at least the number of people who identify as Christian. And it's easy to read that back onto American history as we started off really Christian and we've gone down. Whereas when you step back and have a larger perspective, it's quite the opposite. Even at 65%, America is far more Christian in terms of population than it was at its founding. America was not a Christian nation, but it was actually a deist nation. most of the founding fathers were involved in the Enlightenment. That's where they developed their ideas of the American Republic. And the most common form of religion in the Enlightenment was deism. Deism is the idea that God is distant. God did create the world, and God will judge the world at the end of time, but in between, God doesn't really interfere much. The great example of that is this picture here, which is Jefferson's Bible. Some of you may have heard of it or even seen it. And famously, Jefferson admired the ethical teachings of Jesus, but he cut out all of the miracle stories because he didn't believe that there were miracles. So the benefit of deism and this sort of empty view of God is that it allowed for religious unity. Even though America was not very Christian at its founding, it was incredibly diverse. So the people who were Christian came from all kinds of backgrounds: Catholics, Anglicans, Quakers, Amish, and Mennonite Anabaptist. And what they could all agree on was the kind of generic version of faith, which was deism. So Thomas Jefferson summed up what this looked like. In Jefferson's language, there's only one God and he's all perfect. There's a future state of rewards and punishments. That to love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself is the sum of religion. This was something that all these different Christian groups could get on board with, and later, as immigrants came from non-Christian nations, other people could get on board with. Muslims can get on board with this. Jews can get on board with this. All kinds of people can get on board with this. The founding fathers were ultimately concerned with religious freedom, not with a Christian America. Just to give one example, this is the Treaty of Tripoli. John Adams very clearly states the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. We can also look at the holy book or sacred text of the U.S., which is the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Now, the Declaration of Independence makes two references to the divine. The first, famously at the very beginning, all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And then a little later we get this language of the laws of nature and of nature's God. Now, who is nature's God? Well, this is a very deist way of talking about God, the God who created nature and the laws of nature and left them running, because God is actually, in the back room playing pool, and he's letting the world sort of do its own thing. That's deism. Similarly, this language of God, the Creator. Jefferson will not talk about the Redeemer. Jefferson's not interested in the blood of Jesus or salvation, but simply with creation and judgment. Now, what about the Constitution? Where does it mention God or religion? Well, rack your brains for just a minute. I'll go ahead and tell you. It actually doesn't mention God at all. One story is that someone came to Alexander Hamilton and complained that God was left out of the Constitution, and Hamilton said, oops, we forgot. Now, there are groups of people who believe that these documents, even though they don't mention God, even though they're written by deists, are actually God-ordained. In fact, there's a number of Mormons who hold these documents to be divinely inspired. There's a piece on that in the Atlantic. You can see in this painting Jesus with this Mormon emblem, priesthood on his chest, holding up the Declaration of Independence. So it's not completely unheard of for people to believe that these documents are inspired, that the United States is this sort of God-blessed nation, this chosen nation, distinct from all others. And just to give you another example, and this one is fairly recent, and I'm going to pick on a particular religious figure just because this is so clear, but it wouldn't be difficult to find similar sorts of things in both parties, Republican and Democrat, but this is from Mike Pence, the former vice president. So in a speech at Fort McHenry, in front of all these American flags, back in 2020, Pence says, "So let's run the race marked out for us. Let's fix our eyes on Old Glory and all she represents. Let's fix our eyes on this land of heroes and let their courage inspire. And let's fix our eyes on the author and perfecter of our faith and our freedom, and never forget that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. That means freedom always wins. He's talking to soldiers, right? So winning is in the context of some sort of battle or conflict. And you may hear him sort of loosely quoting some scripture. In fact, he's quoting a couple of things. He's quoting a hymn there at the bottom where the Spirit of the Lord is. But he's also quoting from Hebrews 12. Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus. So what Pence has done here, and this is a perfect example of civil religion, and again, it crosses partisan lines, he's replaced Jesus with Old Glory. He's saying, let's fix our eyes on Old Glory. Let's fix our eyes on the American flag, which is a symbol for America. It's very clear here what is being communicated, that we are supposed to associate in our minds America with Jesus, that these are kind of interchangeable. So, to me, this is just a very clear example of how civil religion identifies the nation and the divine. Now, does this mean America is bad or wicked? No, as I've said, every nation does some version of this. And America is fantastic. American ideals have made the world a better place and continue to be an inspiration for other countries. Things like personal freedom, our form of government democracy, our commitment to peace in the world, real commitment, the cultural tolerance that we have. We really are a multicultural society, and for the most part we do that well, even though we are all familiar with stories where we failed. So America is great, and people who are Americans should celebrate being Americans, and they should give God glory and credit for any good thing that they have. But Christians have to be very careful not to get too wrapped up in this, because their God is a God who is beyond borders. Every nation state, whether America or Mexico or Canada or China or Russia, every nation state is bounded by geographical borders, which are man-made, human-made traditions. Someone just drew lines on maps. Nation states only exist in our imagination. They're not a part of the real world. But they do have real-world effects because they define citizenship. They define who's in and who's out. They define who has access to certain kinds of privileges and responsibilities. And these borders, these artificial borders, are maintained through military power. It's no surprise that each nation state seeks its own agenda. So, of course, Americans are going to be for America and do things that are good for America before anything else. And Russians are going to do what's good for Russia, and Chinese are going to do what's good for China. But Christians have to be careful, because Christians are not just concerned with any one nation. Christians are concerned with all peoples. And they're not confined by borders, sort of like Doctors Without Borders. We have a God who is beyond borders. The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, the world and those who live in it. And there's a real danger of this us versus them thinking, our nation against their nation. I'll just give you two brief examples. The atomic bomb was dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And Japan was the enemy of the U.S. That's true. But did you know that Nagasaki was the home of the largest Christian population in Japan? It's where persecuted Christians had fled back in the 17th and 18th centuries. And the Urakami Church was one of the largest churches in Asia. And it was almost exactly where the bomb fell. Completely incinerated the church. Almost all the Christians in the city were destroyed by the American bomb. So yeah, Americans were the enemies of the Japanese. But in the process, it was Christians who were destroyed. Very similarly, Christians invaded Iraq in 2003, and since then the Christian community in Iraq has dwindled by about 83%. Almost all the Christians have now left Iraq. Now, America didn't intend this. They had other things in mind. But it's a side effect. So there were actually a lot of Christians in Iraq. But because of the American invasion, Christianity in Iraq, as this quote says, is now close to extinction. So I just bring both of these up to show that Christian priorities and Christian values do not always line up with the state. In fact, they are often counter to the state, which is another reason why Christians have to be careful not to be too caught up in any nation, lest that nation's desires, goals, become a kind of God. So let's pop back into the 1st and 2nd centuries briefly to the early church. The letter to Diognetus is an early apologetic work which tries to define what the Christian's role is in a given nation. Again, they're thinking about Rome, but this applies broadly. The writer says, to sum up all in one word, what the soul is in the body, that are Christians in the world. The soul dwells in the body, yet is not of the body. And Christians dwell in the world, yet are not of the world. And we could replace that with, a particular nation. Christians dwell in the United States, but they're not of the United States. Or they dwell in China, but they're not of China. The soul loves the flesh that hates it, and loves also the members. Christians likewise love those who hate them. Christians dwell as sojourners in corruptible bodies, looking for an incorruptible dwelling in heaven. And you read about the letter to Diognetus in the God is Not chapter. So when the writer refers to sojourners, he's thinking back to this passage from 1 Peter 2. You're a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. So you, Christians, you, the church, you are a nation. Your primary allegiance is not to the place you live, it's to the church. You're God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Beloved, I urge you as aliens and exiles, that's that sojourner language, abstain from the desires of the flesh that wage war against the soul. So Christians operate like a small nation within another nation. And maybe the great example is an embassy, right? You can go to Russia or China, and in the U.S. embassy, you're technically on U.S. soil, even while you're in another country. And United States rules and laws apply, even though you're in another country. Similarly, Christians live in the U.S., but they're living by a different set of laws. They have a different set of values and priorities because they're serving a different God than the nation is serving. Now we have to be careful as we read the letter to Diognetus and we read 1 Peter. When for instance, in the letter it says we are looking for this incorruptible dwelling in the heavens, we shouldn't think, Christians are concerned with spiritual and heavenly things and not with earthly temporal things. Well, actually, to be a Christian isn't just to sort of turn all that over to the nation state. Christians are concerned with the body. They're concerned with earthly matters, temporal matters. And so when Peter says you're a chosen race, God's own nation and all, he means that Christians, God's people, still have an obligation to make the world a better place. Actually do the things that nation states are trying to do. Bring order, bring peace, bring justice. So, for instance, the prophet Jeremiah, he says to Israel when they're in exile, just like Peter says, you are in exile. When you find yourself in a foreign nation, what should you do? And there's a sense in which America is a foreign nation to Christians, because Christians belong first and foremost to the church. The prophet says, seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens. Take wives. Have sons and daughters. Multiply and do not decrease. Pray to the Lord on behalf of that nation, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. Again, just translate this into America or whatever nation you're from. Seek the welfare of of the nation of America where I've sent you into exile. You are not of that place, but as it prospers, you too will prosper. I want to close with a song. There's a lot of patriotic songs. There's a lot of songs that kind of reinforce this God is American trope. But there are other kinds of songs, and this song in particular, I think, helps us balance healthy patriotism and this Christian universalism. It's sung to the tune of Finlandia, which some of you may know, the song Be Still My Soul. Be still my soul, the Lord is on your side. Same tune. Listen to the lyrics. This is my song, O God of all the nations, a song of peace for lands afar and mine. This is my home, the country where my heart is. Here are my hopes, my dreams, my holy shrine. So it's acknowledging this healthy patriotism. I love this land. This is where I'm from. I'm devoted to this land. But the song goes on, but other hearts and other lands are beating with hopes and dreams as true and high as mine. So we can love this land and still recognize the worth and value of people in other lands. Similarly, my country's skies are bluer than the ocean, and sunlight beams on cloverleaf and pine. So my country is the most beautiful of all. Just like every parent says their kid's the most beautiful. But other lands have sunlight too, and clover and skies are everywhere as blue as mine. Oh, hear my song, thou God of all the nations, a song of peace for their land and for mine. May truth and freedom come to every nation. May peace abound where strife has raged so long, that each may seek to love and build together a world united, righting every wrong, a world united in its love for freedom, proclaiming peace together in one song. So, God is not American. God is also not Chinese or Panamanian or Israeli or anything else. God is above, beyond national borders. God is the God of all nations. Well, thanks for your kind attention. Please take the quiz. It just shows me that you listened to the lecture. And that'll be that. Hopefully we'll be able to be back together next week. Surely this will be gone by then.